Hello and welcome once again to Speakeasy, where we focus on people in the public eye. As you know, each week my guest is someone who is considered a leader in his field. And certainly my guest today qualifies as just that. He is Dr. Ralph Buultjens, economist and author. And he is perhaps the only person in the country who teaches political science, economics, and comparative religion all at the same time at several universities, both here and abroad. He was born in Sri Lanka. He is the author of several books in politics and religion and is advisor to many international organizations and governments. Now, if you will help me, please welcome Dr. Ralph Buultjens.
Thank you, Janis. It's nice to be with you this afternoon.
It's very nice to have you here. My first question, following this kind of an introduction, is how do you manage political science, economics, comparative religions, and all at the same time, and why do you do these three? How do you see them related?
I think, Janis, the why is more important. I feel that all of these are interconnected. You can't talk about society without talking about power and its distribution, and that's politics. You can't talk about how people live without understanding how they make their living, and that's economics. And those are kind of horizontal relationships. But I think to understand people, which is really why I'm interested in all of these fields, is to understand also a kind of vertical relationship between what they are now and what they try to be, between the inner self and the cosmic self, and that's religion. And those are really the three fields that I have tried to focus on, because my main interest is to try and study societies and people and how they behave within those societies.
Then your whole teaching is really a matter of comparison, isn't it? Are you comparing the way it was to the way it is now? How do you explain changes to your students?
I think that's one dimension, but I think there are two ways of comparing things. One is what we have now, what we can learn from the experience of the past, what it teaches us for the future, and the other is how we relate as people now to other people who live and share our planet with us.
But we have titled our show today, 1984, Brave New World.
Yeah.
Now, why did you select the Orwellian Huxley theme? How do you tie this together?
I think that 1984, Brave New World, two books written 40 and 50 years ago, have a great message for our time. Huxley, writing in the 30s, was talking about a series of developments, genetic developments, biological developments, which really prefigured the modern kind of technological society. And his message was that in a highly technological field, human feelings create tragedy. And it was a warning that we destroy our feelings as we develop our society. Orwell's warning essentially was this in 1984, that barbarism doesn't come from retreating back to primitive states of life, back to the jungles, but really can come from modern technological society. And I think these two books, which were kind of fantasies, are in some ways focus of our present condition or what we might evolve to.
Now, you talked about modern technology. You're talking about industrialization.
I'm talking about modern industrial societies which have a very high technological content and, even more important, a new class of people who operate that technology, the techno-bureaucracy, who in a way are the praetorians of our modern time.
Well, could you explain to me then how this industrialization, modernization, the technology, what we're doing to ourselves, ties in all of these three fields?
Janis, I think we must go back about 200 years, because our society today really was born out of the Industrial Revolution, which was the last great traumatic experience that a large part of the world underwent. the change from agrarian societies to industrial, urban, what we loosely call modern societies. And this involved the transformation of people from lifestyles, new ways of earning their living, new political societies, new way of thinking about themselves. This event, the Industrial Revolution, gave birth a little later on to two great social systems. One is modern industrial capitalism and the other is Marxism. For the past 200 years, these two social systems, these two new religions really, have fought with each other and yet been locked together in something like, you remember the Corsican brothers?
The Alexander Dumas story.
Alexander Dumas story, written about 125 years ago. Two brothers born of the same mother, different in temperament, different in lifestyles, and yet linked by some kind of karmic symmetry over their whole lifespan. And eventually one died and the other felt the pain. And there was a kind of linkage, and modern industrial capitalism and Marxism are very much like that.
How so?
Born from the same mother, the Industrial Revolution, both trying to create worlds of their own, yet linked to each other in an antagonistic kind of embrace, relating to each other, trying to drive each other out, different societies, trying to influence the rest of the world in their own image. And now, I believe, both dying together, either slow kind of self-destruction, or the other possibility is some mutually engineered enormous holocaust. But you see that both in capitalist societies and in communist societies, a great inability to cope with the questions of the day.
You said they may both be dying together.
Yeah.
Well, when something dies out, something else must certainly take its place. What is taking its place?
Well, not necessarily so. We can die out and life can disappear if it's a nuclear holocaust. On the other hand, as you have said, much of history shows that when something declines, something else rises. I think if you look at each of the three areas in which I study, that's politics and economics and religion, you'll see this kind of pattern of slow destruction and new creation. Think what we've been talking about just now. I think in politics you see that a destruction of old systems is taking place. It's taking place in this part of the world. It's more difficult to govern people now. It's taking place in other parts of the world. And
you're talking about then the rise of terrorism?
I'm talking about the rise of terrorism. I'm talking about the declining quality of leadership. I'm talking about, in democratic countries, the poor voter turnout, the fact that people are less amenable to governmental authority. It's becoming more difficult to govern. Also, the authority and influence of the great powers, that is the Soviet Union and the United States, is eroding before our eyes. And the third world is becoming more important. Now, when I talk of the third world, I'm talking of countries, Asia, Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Latin America.
I'm glad you said that, because I think many of our viewers don't really understand what the third world is.
It's a kind of term which is relatively recent in its usage, really refers to lots of people who've been locked out of the decision-making process in world affairs until relatively recently. Many of them were colonized, many of them are still poor. But in a political sense, you see them and their countries beginning to reassert themselves now.
You said they were recently, or they were locked out until recently, and yet we see a very fast surge forward of powers in the third world. This is a rather rapid growth, isn't it, Dr. Buultjens?
Yes, I think that in periods of change, like our period now, you find very dramatic, very rapid kinds of escalation of power. But you see this not only in the rise of new powers, but in the decline of older powers.
Well, just before we go to the decline of the older powers, I don't want you to get off this one point just for one moment. The rise of the smaller powers, let's say the third world, because they're all smaller countries.
Not all. Some are very large,
No,
like China and India.
That's true, that's true.
But many of them are smaller.
This happened, it's happening quickly, it's happening now, but Most of them are poor countries.
That's right.
So how can this rise take place so rapidly when they're economically very poor, politically most of their population is not involved? Where does the power come from?
Well, you don't need today to be big or to be a great power in a traditional sense to have enormous influence and impact on world affairs. A small group of disruptive people, you mentioned terrorism earlier, can have an immense impact, a great disturbance on any society. Once upon a time, if you wanted to plunge New York City into darkness, you had to go from street corner to street corner, breaking every lamp. Today, you just throw a bomb into Conrad's central computer and you've done the job. Highly technologized modern societies are very vulnerable to disturbance by small groups of people. And sometimes you find this in world affairs too. In politics, I think you're seeing a capacity to create great change coming out of the third world. Now,
well, how does this change civilization as we know it?
I think we have, if you look at civilization throughout human history, you will see that power evanesces. It's never constant. Great powers believe that they are there for all time. And it doesn't happen that way. They rise, they plateau, and they decline. And right now, I think the great powers of our time, the United States and the Soviet Union, have reached a plateau if they're not declining. Not that they will disappear, but if you look at France and Britain, 50 years ago, they were the great powers of the world. They haven't disappeared, but they're not first-class powers today. And I think we are on that way.
I see, and that's why you cannot separate the three areas that you are an expert in. Because if you say, well, they are declining because of economics, that means something is wrong politically. Now, the only trouble I have is in the religion aspect of this triad of yours. I can easily equate the political science with the economy, but could you please tell me more about the religion?
Yeah. 200 years ago, I told you that Industrial Revolution was a tremendous kind of traumatic change in societies. And from it, a number of developments took place. New secular religions, like Marxism, like industrial capitalism, really embracing sets of values, how people relate to each other, how they relate to society, how they should live, what the meaning of life is, began to evolve. Now those are slowly eroding. On the other hand, the old line religions, the mainstream religions in Western society particularly, have been on the defensive for some time, but have somehow survived. Now they too are under a kind of assault, if you want to use the word loosely, from all sorts of new religious cultural influences.
Well, excuse me, one moment, please. That's something I really want to get into in depth with you. But first, I would just like to pass along the address of the program to our viewers, if I may, because I know they're going to have a lot of questions and comments for you, possibly for me, on this very topic. If you have any comments, anything you care to write to Dr. Ralph Buultjens or to address to me, you may do so by writing to Speakeasy, and that is Post Office Box 2695, Rockefeller Center Station, New York, New York, 10185. And that address will appear at the end of the program again if you missed it. Thank you, Dr. Buultjens. Please, now I want to get in depth into this particular area.
All right.
If you could continue.
We're talking about religion.
Yes.
All religions, it seems to me, have certain messages. And we've seen in the past several decades the problems of society reflected in a way in the attitude of people to religion. There is no logical reason why religion should have survived into the 20th century. It's the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, and the age of disbelief. And yet it has persisted. Now, today, you will notice that around the Western societies, which have been influenced by the great secular religions and the old-line traditional religions of the West, there is a great kind of quest by people, young and not so young, for all sorts of new religious experiences. Sometimes it takes the form of cults.
Yes.
Sometimes it takes the form of being born again, kind of hot gospeling version of the old religions. And there is an extraordinary interest in religions which come out of the third world. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and other faiths.
And we're seeing a very big rise in Islam, for example. Why? If people are getting away from, as you say, organized religion as we have known it, why then is Islam growing?
Because Islam offers certain things that other religions don't quite offer. For example, Islam offers a kind of brotherhood of the underprivileged. It's not a religion that's been associated with Western colonialism. It's a religion which talks about the essential equality of people. It's a religion which today is very well financed, because the great believers of Islam, the homelands of Islam, have got a lot of capital with which to engage in missionary activity. And it has a kind of appeal because it is a simply stated message around one central theme: the submission of human beings to God and the dedication of individuals to God's work. It doesn't have the complex theologies of very abstruse philosophies. In times of change, people look for such central messages.
In other words, you're saying that people are looking to be told exactly what to do without having to think about it?
No, not quite in that sense. I think in times of great dislocation, people look to something which offers them verities that they believe are true, a central core to which they can relate. And Islam is one of those faiths, particularly in many parts of the third world, but increasingly in the more affluent areas of the world too.
But you did say just a moment ago that in the third world countries they have the capital to develop this kind of missionary appeal.
I said in some of the Islamic countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I thought that those were some of the very countries that were now suffering for the very first time in history, suffering economically.
No, if you look at some of the Muslim countries around the Persian Gulf, for example, they have been the great beneficiaries of a 10-year price rise in oil. Now, you must also understand something.
Until recently.
Until recently. But people talk about deprivation due to the fall of price in oil. It's a lot of nonsense. The price of oil today is $30 a barrel. 10 years ago, it was $2.40 a barrel. It's fallen from $34 a year ago to $30. If you are an oil producer, you're still getting $30 a barrel. Now, you must understand something else about Islam, I think. Islam does require those who belong to it to devote a certain part of their income, their revenue, their capital to religious work. It's called zakat. I think in the Western world it used to be called tithing some years ago. And many people and many governments contribute something towards the spread of the faith. And that makes it a very well-financed kind of religion. Now, that's not unusual. Many religions have this element to it. But today, Islam is spreading very fast, and this is one of the reasons.
How much of that is put back into the country? Anything at all?
You mean oil revenues?
Their zakat.
Yeah.
How much of that is put back in to the country, to the people, economically?
A certain amount of it.
I'm trying to keep this tied in now with the religion and the politics and the economics.
A certain amount of it does go for charitable works, kind of social service. And a good part of it goes for spreading the faith abroad and at home. So that religious work can be seen both as localized and internationalized.
You also hinted, I believe, a moment ago about it rising in the Western world.
Yes. I think if you look around the Western world, you will see, for example, in this country, a large number of people who've converted to Islam in the past 5 or 10 years. Among them are the black Muslims, but there are many others. In Western Europe, you find Islamic groups developing. The other day in Panama, I saw a mosque, a very unusual thing to see in a Catholic country in Central America. There is no doubt that Islam is one of those faiths that has captured the imagination of many people in the past decade or so.
How much time do you spend abroad?
Oh, each year, several months, in various...
I know you do a lot of work in India.
Yes, I do.
Now, do you get to see this then? Do you look for this in particular? Do you talk to the people? I'm not just talking about the people in government with whom you associate, but I'm talking about the merchant in the street. Do you get to talk to him in these countries?
Yeah. You see, one of the things that people like myself do is not to take too many views too seriously. The only way of testing belief is to check and counter-check. And I think one must take the extreme critic and the most fervent supporter. The truth is somewhere usually between the two. And what I try to do is to talk to the ordinary people and then relate it to the views that one gets from what you might call the elite in society. The gap somewhere between the two is a great body of truth which we social scientists try to scratch at, and if we are lucky, find some of it. The quest for truth is a human quest gone on for history.
Hopefully it will continue if we have a future.
It's like true love.
A history.
It's like true love, very rarely attainable, but must always be pursued.
I like that. Now you say that this basically comes from the industrialization that took place. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you?
I said that the changes in Western society were impacted, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, and that spread around the world. Yeah.
All right, and therefore that has caused great changes in religion in the world.
Yeah.
Obviously, politically, we can all see this. We can read the newspapers and see what's happening around the world. Therefore, economics. Where do you see it going?
Well, if you think a little bit about what we've discussed, you will see that in each of the areas we spoke about, politics, economics, and religion, there is a kind of period of disturbance going on around the world. And much of that disturbance, or you can call about change, if you want to use some euphemistic term, whatever it is, comes out from the third world. The impact of the third world and politics, economic problems, the whole debt question is a question, relationship between the third world and the richer countries, the religious interest, the kind of continuing theme through all of these three areas is a third world presence that's increasing. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that we are watching a new kind of civilization in the making.
And do you think there's any resentment from...
Oh yes, I think there is and there will be great resentment for people of position and power. Don't give it up easily, and they will fight to keep it. And if you look at demographics, you'll see something else, Janis. That is that today the rich countries of the world really account for a very small percentage of the world's population. This is diminishing as time goes on. And there is no way in which a small group of nations, maybe 20% of the world's population today, 10% 50 years from now, can control global economics, global politics, and global thought patterns in the future.
I think we can see that reflected in the growth of the UN in the last 25 years.
Yes, I think the character of the UN has changed. Its effectiveness may not have increased, but its whole character and its structure has changed very substantially. Now, my view of the UN is that it is an exceptionally ineffective organization, but it is in many ways a true reflection of the world as it is today. And if the mirror is not very pleasant, we should perhaps look at the subject rather than condemn the mirror.
Therefore, what should we do? Now, you say the larger powers are losing power.
Yes.
The third world is rising, hence disturbance is the word that you used. Where do you see that disturbance leading?
I think we are in a kind of axial period in civilization between the passage of one, that is essentially the Western domination of the world from about 1450, 1500, the age of discovery, and now. And we are now kind of moving from that into something new. We are in this axial period, which is a period of confusion, a period of disturbance, disturbance always precedes creation. And what we are trying to create is not yet quite visible. I think there are two clear paths. One is the path, or maybe three clear paths. One is the path that we were warned about by Orwell and Huxley, the message of 1984 of a brave new world. The other is kind of bumbling along, confused, hoping no accidents take place. The third is trying to accommodate and create some kind of new structure of power sharing, of a planetary interdependence in which third world countries will play a greater role than they have played before, and richer countries will have to adjust and accommodate to that.
Well, you are the expert. Do you remain objective, or are you hopeful?
At times I'm very pessimistic, but I think we must all have hope, otherwise there's no point in studying these fields. I think that if you look around the world today, there is enough sign of hope to give us some belief that the human species can continue to function with some vision. If trend is destiny, we are finished. But human beings have a capacity to alter trends and therefore change their destiny.
Dr. Buultjens, thank you very, very much for being with us today. This was an extremely informative half hour, and I'm just sorry that we don't have more time. Perhaps another time.
Thank you very much, Janis. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you. For Speakeasy, this is Janis Lasser. See you again next week.